Hello, hi. I'm State Senator Mary Washington. It's so good to see all of you here. I'm a Maryland State Senator and I represent the 43rd Legislative District. Thank you for joining us. My district represents north central portions of Baltimore City. I'm also the first LGBTQ Black person elected to state office in Maryland. And this is my first time hosting what used to be our Sunday socials. Many of us have been, the last 2 months, we've been under stay-at-home orders, and Victory Fund has been bringing us this bi-weekly Sunday social. So you could hear from LGBTQ elected officials like myself, and also you can hear from candidates who are really making changes in our communities. But because of the historic and transformational and what I hope is actually a paradigm shift in our country when it comes to ending racism, being an ally, fighting back against racial disparities, whether it's in housing, employment, healthcare, and now law enforcement for all people of color, but especially Black people in this country. Victory Fund has renamed this Sunday solidarity event, has renamed this Sunday social event Solidarity Sunday. And we're going to hear from queer and Black voices across our country. And today we're being joined by some exceptional people. Our guests are U.S. congressional candidates Richie Torres and Mondaire Jones. And we were going to hear from one of my really good friends, Colorado State Representative Leslie Herod, who was actually the moderator last week, but they're having a power outage in Colorado, in her town. And so she's not able to join us today. But Leslie, Representative Herod, we're with you. I was really struck by the stories that you shared last week. I'm continue to be struck by the work that you do. Our run of show for today, we just launched live on our Facebook page. You can, again, please, you can participate in the conversation by typing on our Facebook page if you have any questions, and if you have some ideas or things you want to share. And we're going to spend a lot of time having a good and positive conversation, not unlike the conversation that you heard last week from City Councilor Denise Simmons of Cambridge, Massachusetts, Marquis Snow, who is running for office in Nebraska. He's running for election to the Nebraska State Senate. He was there. We had Council President Hardin from Columbus, Ohio. And as I said earlier, Representative Herod from Colorado was there. They brought some really huge themes from last week, talking about structural racism, institutional racism, COVID-19. There was some discussion about the White House and the lack of leadership there, and what people are experiencing actually on the ground. And so today we really appreciate your insights and perspectives. And our panel, I'm going to tell you a little more about our panelists, and you're going to be hearing from them. So U.S. congressional candidate Richie Torres has joined us. He wants to represent the 15th U.S. congressional district. At 25, he actually became the youngest elected official in New York City and the first LGBT elected official from the Bronx. And he's currently a councilman in New York City. And when we elect him, he will become the first Afro-Latinx member of Congress. We're also joined by Mondaire Jones, 17th Congressional District. I'm just going to check in and make sure my folks are still there. Hi, guys. We're joined by, again, Mondaire Jones. He would like to represent the 17th U.S. Congressional District as part of New York. He would make history by becoming the first openly LGBTQ Black man. And there are no LGBT Black persons that have been elected to U.S. Congress. There are only 2 openly LGBTQ people of color who have served. And both of these races are really key. For those of you who are listening, they are really key to ensuring and improving our efforts to increase not only the number of LGBTQ people who are representing us. My association with the Victory Fund goes back to about 2009 when I went to one of the first conferences that was offered for me, my first conference by the Victory Institute. And so Victory Fund and Victory Institute has always had an agenda of electing more LGBTQ people. But what we're here today is to talk about not just the fact that we are queer, not just the fact that we identify on our sexuality spectrum, but also we identify as progressive, as anti-racist, as anti-sexist, as anti-transphobic. And when we elect these two gentlemen, that's who we are electing, to increasing the number of people who are in our federal government who stand for those issues. So again, I welcome, and if you don't mind, if just a quick introduction, Councilman Torres, would you say a couple of quick words? We'll keep going back and forth, but I don't want this to be a monologue. But if you just want to say a couple of things about yourself you think people should know, and then quickly again with Mr. Jones, and then we'll get right into it.
Sure. So I got my start in politics as a housing organizer. I grew up in public housing, literally right across the street from Trump Golf Course. And so while the conditions in my home were getting worse, mold and mildew, leaks and lead, no air conditioning in the summer, no heat and hot water in the winter, the city of New York was investing more than $100 million in a golf course for Donald Trump. And I remember wondering to myself at the time, like, what does it say about the values and priorities of our society that we care more about a golf course than the lives, the largely black and brown lives in public housing? And in my mind, it was no greater devaluation of black and brown life than the neglect of affordable housing for communities of color. So I ran for public office when I was 24, knocked on thousands of doors, won on the strength of door-to-door campaigning. I've been in the city council ever since, a leading champion of residents in public housing. And now I'm running in the most fiercely contested congressional race in New York City, 12 candidates, 5 elected officials. And one of my opponents is a Trump Republican, a PBA-backed Trump Republican masquerading as a Democrat. There's a real risk that the most Democratic district in America could fall into the homophobic hands of a pro-Trump Republican backed by the police unions. So it's a crazy race and a crazy time.
And you're best positioned to be able to you two are considered the top two.
Yeah. So even though there are 12 candidates, Data for Progress released a poll that had Diaz and myself in a statistical tie with everyone else far behind. So I have a fighting chance of defeating him. You know, we're well resourced. We're running an aggressive campaign. My nightmare fear is that given the overcrowding in the race, Ruben Diaz Sr. could conceivably eke out a narrow win at the margins, which would represent a nightmare for the LGBTQ community and the Democratic Party. Right. And so I'm fighting my heart out to maximize every single vote. This is an election that could be won by a few votes.
And there's so many elections like that. We're experiencing that here in Baltimore City. That it's with the changes in the electoral system, the changes of moving to mail-in ballot, the concerns around COVID infections, and frankly the ongoing efforts to disenfranchise low-income people, African Americans, other disenfranchised people. Again, making sure that that we support candidates like you is really important. Mr. Jones, you're not yet an elected official, but I'm sure you've done some great things in your communities. And then certainly we're going to have a full half hour to really get into the substance of what is driving so many of us here to really openly address the racism in our state, in our country. But I just wanted to give you a couple of minutes to just sort of talk about yourself as a candidate and what you're trying to do in your race and what it's like.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity, Senator, and many thanks also to Victory Fund and people who are viewing this. I'll start by saying that Victory Fund was the first organization to endorse my campaign. I'm so grateful to the organization because while a lot of institutional players and individual folks have come in, thankfully at the national level even, to start this campaign, Victory Fund was there from the very beginning, and that means a lot to me. Unlike many of the people we're used to seeing in our politics, I don't come from money or from a political family. I grew up in Section 8 housing and on food stamps, and my young single mom still had to work multiple jobs just to put food on the table for us. So when we talk about things like a $15 minimum wage at the federal level being absolutely necessary, that is something I know firsthand to be true. And my mom got help raising me from my grandparents. My grandfather was a janitor, and my grandmother cleaned homes. And when daycare was expensive, she took me to work with her. And now I get to run to represent the same people whose homes I watched my grandmother clean growing up. And when presidential candidates like Elizabeth Warren, who endorsed my campaign in January, talk about providing universal child care in this country, that's a fight I want to join when I get to Washington, because I know that there is an urgent need for that. And I don't want anyone to have to go through what I went through when I was growing up. I got my start in politics as a freshman at a local high school, organizing people to get out the vote and to vote in the school board election, which was in peril constantly of being voted down in the East Ramapo Central School District. I went on to Stanford University, got increasingly involved in progressive causes, was able to chair a committee on the NAACP's National Board of Directors at the age of 19, then worked in the Obama administration at the Department of Justice on criminal justice reform and judicial nominations, which I can assure you is not happening today under this president in a meaningful way anyway. Attended Harvard Law School, got involved in providing pro bono legal representation to folks in Dorchester and in Roxbury, many of whom looked like me. And I saw firsthand what I already knew as a Black guy growing up in this country, which is that folks like me are over-policed, over-arrested, over-prosecuted, and over-sentenced for things that other people never get into trouble for. I went and worked at a firm in Manhattan for a number of years, did a bunch of pro bono, also founded a nonprofit called Rising Leaders that teaches professional skills to underserved middle school students in 3 American cities. And more recently, I've been a lawyer for Westchester County, litigating and winning the county's biggest cases and serving as a legal advisor to a number of elected officials on the Democratic side. My chief opponent is a Trump Republican as well. What do you know? He is, according to the polling, tied in a dead heat with me and 2 other candidates. It is a crowded race. There are now 7 people. 1 person dropped out a few days ago. But this is a campaign that is going to be won on probably just a few votes, because it's so split, and you've got a number of well-financed people running for Congress, myself included, thank God. But it's important that we not elect someone who has spent most of his career in the state Senate caucusing with Republicans and preventing any number of progressive pieces of legislation, including for the LGBTQIA community, from getting passed. That is what is at stake in this election.
Thank you. And in your Facebook comments section, typically the Victory Fund has solicited funds for the Victory Fund during these comments. But what we're really trying to do, as these 2 great leaders are showing, and then leaders have passed, and what we're seeing nationally is really if we need the paradigm shift that we need, that as Black Americans, as Black LGBTQ, that we are vital to be a part of this conversation. And so there's going to be a link, and if you make a contribution to that link, those funds are going to be distributed throughout all of the Black LGBT candidates that are in competitive races this year. So I really want to encourage you to click that link and to correct directly to their campaigns. I'm just going to start a little bit about, because one of the things that we know we are here, and something that's really important is to say names, of course, and our names that are bringing us at this particular moment, and the protests across our country and actually the world, are George Floyd, but Breonna Taylor also, Tony McDade, David McAddy, and just so many, many others. When we look at what can we do, or what must we do to end this disproportionate impact that is literally killing Black Americans in this country. And as I just said, I represent Northeast Baltimore City. And so just 5 years ago, we were at the epicenter with Freddie Gray. And so, and understanding that it's not enough to simply protest. It's not enough to simply say no more. We really, and I think of the parallel between being LGBT affirming, being trans affirming. We need to move from just simply being affirming and to actually begin to actively dismantle. So I wanted to ask our panelists, what I see in Baltimore is a real youth leaders really standing on the front lines of our protests here in Baltimore. Can you tell me what you're seeing on the ground in your communities?
Well, here in New York City, young people are driving the movement for police reform, which is not only true of police reform, but gun safety and climate justice. I think it's millennials, it's Generation Z that have been the driving forces behind progressive movements unfolding throughout the country. And my sense is that young people are sick and tired of being sick and tired. That people are just shocked by the depth of resistance to change. I mean, take, Will Smith had a wonderful quote. He said, the problem is not that racism is getting worse, it's getting filmed. But even when it's filmed, even when it's unprovoked, it's almost impossible to punish police brutality. It took 5 years for the city of New York to fire Pantaleo, who suffocated Eric Garner to death on video for everyone to see. It took him 5 years. Every day, people are fired for reasons that are far less serious than causing someone's death. And so that's what's frustrating people. And I agree with them. I think we have no choice but to recognize that voting, though important, has limitations. It's a necessary but insufficient condition for political and social change, and that we have no choice but to agitate. We have no choice but to creatively disrupt the status quo, or else the system is going to continue business as usual. The political establishment cannot be trusted to enact change out of the kindness of its own heart. It will only do so under pressure. Right? It reminds me of Newton's laws of physics. An object at rest will remain at rest unless acted upon by an outside force. Young people are the outside force acting upon our failed politics.
Mm-hmm. And how about you, Mr. Jen? What are your thoughts?
I agree with Richie. This is hopefully a watershed moment. Though I am conscious of the fact that we've had a number of protests over the past several years. Black Lives Matter, its inception was under a different president, Barack Obama, and so that we have to do this differently this time around. More people have to take this seriously, and based on what I'm seeing in terms of attendance and the composition of the folks at these rallies, right? Most of the people I'm seeing in my district who are at these rallies are white. And not just because my district is overwhelmingly white, because it doesn't have to be the case that would translate to white folks largely being the people out protesting and rallying. But I think people are finally seeing it, young people most acutely, that we cannot continue the status quo. It is unsustainable. It's not great for the social fabric of our country. In fact, it's corrosive. It undermines our democracy and our institutions when people don't have faith in law enforcement and in entire groups of people. And I'm also grateful for the opportunity now to be talking about the fact that this is not just an issue on the other side of the political spectrum. I'm a lifelong proud Democrat, but as I said at a rally in Peekskill last night, you got too many Democrats who are now only all of a sudden talking about racial justice and racial injustice after national protests. And so we need more people in Congress for whom policy is personal. Shouldn't be that state legislators now running for Congress are all of a sudden co-sponsoring legislation to repeal 50A, which would allow for us to see the disciplinary records of law enforcement officials. Many of these folks are repeat bad actors who have never been held accountable and until the point where someone is suffocated to death or is otherwise murdered unjustifiably. And so here's a real opportunity to elect new leadership in the Democratic Party, and I'm grateful for that opportunity.
Can I say something about 50A?
And of course, please. This is a conversation.
Yeah, it's an issue that frustrates me because, Mayor de Blasio ran in 2013 on a platform of police reform. And when he became mayor, he actually did something to the right of both Bloomberg and Giuliani. He reinterpreted 50A to prohibit the disclosure of disciplinary outcomes. Now, here's how perverse this is. 50A is a provision of civil rights law. So the city of New York uses civil rights law to protect officers who violate civil rights, right? Only in New York City can that perversity prevail. And, finally, we're talking about repealing it. But for me, even the repeal of 50A is incremental. Like, I don't simply want to disclose disciplinary outcomes. I want to ensure an independent system for punishing, firing, and if necessary, prosecuting police misconduct. We need something more than transparency. We need actual accountability.
Absolutely. And that's, I want to share something. So some of my background, so I'm a sociologist and in particular, a historical sociologist. And I always like to have an opportunity to share and educate some folks. And there's a really wonderful text. If you want to, so I guess it gets to our point of, it's not simply enough to continue to be reactive. As policymakers, as legislators, it's very important for us to fundamentally understand, as the councilman just said, that that things are frankly built into the infrastructure and into the laws of our country that are so-called colorblind. But what they really are doing is reinforcing and maintaining the status quo, which in most of our communities is a white conservative establishment. And so there's a text. It's a New York Times bestseller. It's Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. And I want you gentlemen just to listen a little bit and then react to it. And then we'll just do a little discussion. Saying that every historian writes and is impacted by a precise historical moment. He says, my moment coincides with the televised and untelevised killings of unarmed human beings at the hands of law enforcement officials, with the televised and untelevised life of the shooting star of Black Lives Matter during America's stormiest nights. I somehow managed to write this book between the heartbreaks of Trayvon Martin, Rekia Boyd, and Michael Brown, and Freddie Gray, and the Charleston Nine, and Sandra Bland, heartbreaks that are products of Americans' history of racist ideas, as much as this history book of racist ideas is the product of these heartbreaks. For you, what are the questions? What are the heartbreaks? What are the hard truths in your communities or in our community, our LGBT community, that we need to confront today?
If you don't mind, Richie, I'll start. I think of a name that has now been obscured in the midst of everything that's been happening. And one name I don't know that we've mentioned is Ahmaud Arbery, and I want to forget him too, because that was the stuff, that was the topic before this past week. My goodness. But Amy Cooper in Central Park, who apparently, according to public reporting, has donated to Democratic presidential candidates. Someone who held herself out to the world as being this liberal, progressive white woman, is recorded threatening to call the police, and in fact, calling the police and using the race of an African-American man who was not threatening her by any stretch. He was just reminding her of a well-publicized rule about leashing her dog. And sort of weaponizing race in that way. And so I think one of the hard truths that a lot of people, when I'm in conversation with white people in my district, are having is a lot of people who think that they are liberal or progressive, whatever word you wanted to use to describe yourself on that spectrum, are actually harboring subconscious, if not conscious, biases against Black and brown people. And those have to be interrogated as well. The most discrimination that I have faced in the course of this campaign, ironically, comes from within the white gay community in terms of the things that have been said to me. In fact, the Stonewall Democrats in the Lower Hudson Valley just endorsed a straight white male candidate who did not so much as have a platform on his website regarding the LGBTQIA community. And so whereas I'm, proudly running to make history as the first openly gay Black member of Congress with by far the most robust platform for the LGBTQIA community. And so we have to do more than just talk about racism sort of in the abstract or in isolation with people who we might have expected to be more likely to be racist because they're in a certain part of the country or they identify a certain way politically. We have to look within ourselves as so-called progressives and liberals to really interrogate our complicity in racism.
Absolutely. Councilman, your thoughts?
I agree with everything Mondaire said, especially about Amy Cooper. I came across an article yesterday in which Jeff Bezos was patting himself on the back for saying Black Lives Matters, despite complaints from a customer. And I thought to myself, there's a difference between virtue and virtue signaling. And I worry that there's too much virtue signaling from some white progressives. And that's my only concern about this moment, is that fighting institutionalized racism is not simply a matter of uttering the words Black Lives Matter, but it's understanding what it means to truly protect communities of color. And for us, protection does not mean over-policing. It means ensuring that everyone has access to safe, decent, affordable housing, or quality, affordable healthcare, or a job that pays enough to put food on the table. That's what true protection for communities of color looks like. And if you're not committed to building a comprehensive social safety net that protects communities of color, vulnerable communities, then in my mind, you're part of the problem rather than part of the solution, right? If you're neutral in a racist status quo, then you're part of the problem.
Yeah, and so, and this is interesting where we sit, right? So hopefully, Mr. Jones, you'll be joining us as elected officials. And so, however, we're in this space where, and I'm talking a little more as the moderator because there's just the two of you, and I just want to use this opportunity. But we have this kind of dual consciousness. I mean, I was listening to the program, to the discussion last week, where it's like, we are the law, like we are making the laws, right? We are part of the system, but then also we are not part of it. And so then there are times when we are lifted up as the face and to legitimize, right? As you're saying, to legitimize the diversity of the progressiveness of the party. And then once that moment is over, it goes back to the way things were. And so for me, what would signal us being different is that these Solidarity Sundays, that the protests that are happening continue to be about fundamentally changing our housing policies, right? Our unemployment policies, as you said, the social safety net. But also, we do have to reform law enforcement and how communities are policed. So I just want to pivot to that one for a moment, and thinking more on a federal level. What are some things that, as a state legislator or as a council person, that we should get and should be asking from our federal partners to ensure that there's accountability and transparency, but that frankly we're ending the racist structures that are currently in so many of our police departments? So I guess Mondaire, if you want to, I see you nodding your head. Torres.
I imagine as Richie has been thinking a lot about what the federal government has to be doing and frankly what it's failed to do. We need national standards in policing, and I understand that there are some constitutional concerns around that, but we can at least use financial incentives and disincentives in the way that the 1994 crime bill did. Standards that include eliminating chokeholds, but also requiring officers to identify themselves and to de-escalate. These are people who are supposed to have special expertise in policing, and so we have to require that they engage in de-escalation tactics. Certainly, they can do it for mass shooters who are white, who they famously will give food from Burger King on the way to taking them to the local police precinct. So we know that police officers can de-escalate when they want to. Now we have to require them to do it. As Richie mentioned earlier, we also need independent oversight. It should not be that district attorneys are the ones investigating and being tasked with prosecuting police officers with whom they work and rely on every single day. There's an inherent conflict of interest there. It should be the attorney general or some other independent entity that's not working every single day with these police officers who are responsible for seeking justice. And then more broadly, in the space of criminal justice reform, we have to do things like repealing the 1994 crime bill. We have to make sure that we are not militarizing any further our local law enforcement agencies. We have to end mass incarceration. For me, that looks like investing in alternatives to incarceration, eliminating crazy things like mandatory minimums and legalizing cannabis. Those are some of the things that I've been thinking of.
Great. Congressman.
Freudian slip, but I'll take it.
No, it's I'm putting it out there, as they say.
I liked it.
So the honest truth, there is a limit to what the federal government can do because most criminal justice reforms are driven by the state and local government. But the greatest leverage we have here is the power of the purse. We can leverage the power of federal funds. That if you're a police department and you wish to receive federal funds, there has to be an independent prosecutor in every state. Like for me, the core issue is accountability.
Yes.
I said publicly a few days ago that we all condemn civilians who do violence to officers, and we condemn officers who do violence to civilians. But the problem is we have a two-tier criminal justice system that punishes violence against officers, but covers up violence by officers, right? And that's the double standard that has the legitimacy of our criminal justice system crumbling. So for me, where there is no police accountability, there will never be an end to police brutality. So the federal government should require every state and local funding seeking federal funding to have an independent system for disciplining, investigating, and if necessary, prosecuting police officers. Because without the threat of criminal prosecution, officers have no incentive to practice restraint or de-escalation. What I have seen in New York City is nothing resembling restraint. Right? I've seen an officer shove a woman to the pavement. There was a young man of color who had his hands up. He was restrained. The officer removed his mask just so that he could pepper spray him. I saw an officer drive a vehicle into a crowd of people. I saw an officer, wield a gun at unarmed civilians in a naked attempt at intimidation. And almost all the officers are able to do it with impunity. And so for me, the core issue is accountability for all, that whether or not you wear a uniform, whether or not you have a badge, you have to be held accountable, because as long as officers are above the law, then communities of color will remain unprotected beneath the law.
And this is really consistent with with Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, right? The resolution that she's introduced condemning police brutality, but also getting at that accountability that you're talking about, making sure that there is oversight and independent investigations in each case, establishing civilian review boards. We have a civilian review board in Baltimore, but it doesn't have the kind of power that it needs to actually, the authority to investigate the incidents of police misconduct. And I agree as well, and it's something I've been having conversations with retired police officers and people who I believe, my brother's a police officer in Philadelphia, and so I've certainly been having conversations with him my whole life, but truly understanding that there are individuals, and not in this kind of sort of trying to make excuses, but more of that, just as there are those of us among elected officials who are not productive and counter to change and not operating in the interests of the republic. There are police officers who do see what needs to happen and who have been asking and fighting for what needs to happen. In my conversations with those police officers, they 100% agree that there has to be an independent authority, and that, as the two of you have just said, that we have to link it to the purse strings, because the culture has to change internally as well, that the people who are the training officers, right, are not training in these brutal practices, because you cannot train in those brutal practices, because those brutal practices will result in you losing revenue and losing money, federal money that you need to run your operations. And so again, having some kind of way that we make federal funding and do that. And I think that that's where our state legislatures, and working really closely with our federal partners and our local partners are going to be the way that we can make this change. Again, I just want to remind people, please join the conversation. We've got another 10 minutes. We're ending about a quarter of one, but we would really like to hear your questions, your ideas, your concerns, your thoughts about how we can make things better. Any other gentlemen, anything that additionally you wanted to add at this point? Trying to get back to your screen.
Yeah, I just would add, there was an incident in Buffalo where an officer knocked down an elderly man unjustifiably, And the officer shockingly was held accountable, and the whole squad, the whole police squad, resigned in solidarity with that officer. Solidarity. And so in my mind, that refutes the quote unquote bad apples theory, that the problem is only the behavior of a few, and if only we remove those officers, then everything will be wonderful in American policing. That's delusional. And this might not be an imperfect analogy, but I think the officers who need to be fired are like rotten limbs that need to be amputated. Even after the amputation, the body still has diabetes.
Right.
And so even if you remove the most egregious actors, American policing will still have a disease, and that disease is the blue wall of silence. It is the culture of impunity that treats the badge as a license to kill. That is the problem. The police unions that defend a status quo that brutalizes Black and brown lives are voted into those positions by rank and file members.
Yes.
So I refuse to accept the notion that this is only the bad behavior of a few and that everyone else is wonderful. That's just refuted by the facts that I've seen on the ground.
And it's the culture. And so to my point, I guess I want to make sure I'm being clear that it is, and why I want to offer kind of a historical analysis, that the very institution of policing, like the way that everything about how we've established and formed the police forces in our country has been about the suppression of Black Americans or the co-opting of the histories around the co-opting of immigrants, of white immigrants, to maintain a status quo. I mean, I guess I want to just read a couple of other things from this. Again, I'm going to recommend Stamped from the Beginning. It's got lots of pages, but there's some really great analysis. He says in the prologue, when the Obamas of the nation broke through racial barriers, the Trumps of the nation did not retire to their sunny estates in Florida. They created and sometimes succeeded in putting new and more sophisticated barriers in place, like the grandchildren of Jim Crow laws, the new age voter ID laws that are disenfranchising Black Americans in the 21st century. And the Trumps of the nation developed a new round of racist ideas to justify those policies, to redirect the blame for racial disparities away from the new discriminatory policies and onto the supposed Black pathology. If Barack Obama came to embody Americans' history of racial progress, then Donald Trump should come to embody Americans' history of racist progress. And the racist progress has consistently followed racial progress. Thoughts? Yeah, sorry. Yes. I mean, it's setting it up that what you're saying is this isn't something that just started, that these battles that very often and I think it's not unlike marriage equality or gay rights or women's rights, that we pass a law and we think, oh, we've won.
There's a historical context.
Right. And so you don't see that, look, this is an ongoing struggle for our nation and for ourselves, and that the folks that were on the opposite side didn't get away. Someone just asked about what does it mean to defund the police? What does that mean? Someone says, what's your perception of what defund the police means?
I think.
No, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, I think it will vary by the person, in the same way that Abolish ICE will vary by the person who responds to a request for an explanation. But I wanted to, this I think is relevant because I was reminded of, as we were making observations about things that are going on, the fact that the LAPD is going to see over, I think, $100 million of its budget diverted to other more constructive ways of improving public safety in our communities. We know that the Minneapolis City Council is also going to be reduced. In fact, the city council president says that they are going to radically reimagine what a police department, if any, should look like in the city of Minneapolis in the wake of what has happened with George Floyd. And so defund the police is obviously the term of the week or the day or whatever. But I think really conceptually, it's about making sure that we are diverting money from police departments and investing them into long-term solutions to issues of public safety, reducing crime in a way that does not police Black and brown bodies, and subject them to disparate treatment and inhumane treatment under the law, and hopefully making people feel good about their elected officials and the agencies tasked with protecting them.
Mm-hmm. And so in rally speak, defund the police. Again, I think to your point that as policymakers, what that looks like varies, and it's about reinvesting in the things that we know that works. It's investing in education. It's investing in good transportation. It's investing in good public health. It's investing in those things and jobs for young people, and away from lawsuits. I mean, one of the things in my city is that we spend tens of millions of dollars of lawsuits because of excessive force. So if you took those tens of millions of dollars and directed it into recreation programs, or directed it into, there's a question here that's talking about the importance of training law enforcement in psychology so that they can assess the situation accurately when in crisis situations. I guess, Councilman, what is your reaction
to the previous question as well? Because as a councilman, I'm going to vote on the NYPD's budget.
Yeah, please do it. Please.
This is the number one. So since FY 2009, the city of New York has spent more than $100 million on NYPD settlements. Since 2014, more than $200 million. In FY 2017, more than $300 million. And in the latest fiscal year, over $700 million in NYPD overtime. A few months ago, the mayor proposed a budget, even after COVID-19, even though COVID-19 revealed the deeper racial inequalities that conspire against people of color. The mayor, who claims to be a progressive, proposed a budget that would eviscerate youth services by 1/3 while keeping the NYPD's budget intact, cutting the NYPD by only 1/3 of 1 percentage point. And the city council said that's a non-starter.
Yes.
And there are several members like myself who will not vote for a budget unless it reduces and reforms policing, period. We're not going to continue subsidizing over policing or obscene overtime, or in the case of settlements, we're not going to subsidize police misconduct.
And just like with COVID-19 and the racial disparities that have been highlighted there, just this whole pressure on our system is showing the cracks that are all the way that currently exist and have existed for decades. And thanks for that history, because there's the I'm some of what might be behind some questions is, well, we have to have a police force, but you don't have to have the kind of police force that we have, right? We don't have to continue. It's not about returning to the way things were. Well, we want things to go back the way they were. It's like, no, we don't. We actually want to make them better. And there's been a real highlighting, where those disparities are. There's a question about the role of the unions, and both of you are New York City, and talking about how do you get around police unions' efforts against reform? So that's the question. What do you think can be done to get around police unions' efforts against reform?
Richie, I think you should take the lead on that here in New York City.
The police unions are one of the most destructive forces in American politics. I would say, I can speak about this for an hour, but Mayor de Blasio ran as a police reformer and has become almost a propagandist for the police department. And that's largely because of the police union. When the mayor spoke about his own son's experience with over-policing, when 2 officers were killed, Pat Lynch saw an opportunity to say the mayor has blood on his hands, which led the rank and file of the NYPD to turn their backs on the mayor during a public event. And ever since then, the mayor has governed in fear of his own police department. The policing policy of New York City is nothing more than the product of fear and post-traumatic stress from an NYPD backlash. And that was prompted by the police unions. The worst of them is the Sergeant Benevolent Association. The Sergeant Benevolent Association released the confidential arrest records of the mayor's daughter and posted it on Twitter, which is illegal. It is a crime. The head of the SBA, the Sergeant Benevolent Association, referred to the health commissioner, a Latina, as the B word.
Yes.
And these are the people. This leadership is voted into by the rank and file.
Right. And so we're coming to the end. So I asked you a question. We were coming up on 12:45, but I want to just remind people why we're here. That we're here because of being tired of being tired of that. This isn't something. I just want. I'm saying that this isn't something that is just happened. This is something that continues to happen. The killing of Black and brown people at the hands of police officers, the disparate death rates at the hands of COVID. It has to do with our broken systems, whether our healthcare systems, our housing systems, and frankly, even now in some of the ways that we are voting, our voting systems. And you, the people on this Facebook Live, you have the ability to change that. You have the ability to support candidates that have a historical understanding and have relationships and understanding of how to go about making things different. If you want things to be different in the future, we have to behave differently. Support these elected leaders. Support these two congresspeople. Thank you. I see I said it again. Thank you. Please go to the Facebook page. Go to their Facebook pages. I want to thank Mondaire Jones. He's an activist. He's a congressional candidate who's running in District 17. He represents Rockland. He wants to represent Rockland and Westchester. He would be the first openly LGBT Black member of Congress. Please also vote for and support New York City Councilman Richie Torres, who's running in New York 15 in a congressional seat in the Bronx, and he would become the first Afro-Latinx member of Congress. But as we said on the onset, this is not simply about that voting for us to be the first. It's about voting to make sure that that never again are we having the types of videos that we're seeing. Never again can we say that our police forces are undermined by racism. Never again will we say that we have a public health crisis that is disproportionately impacting people of color and vulnerable color. We're imagining and having an America and a country that is different than the one we have today. Thank you so much for joining us. Please come in 2 weeks. There'll be another great discussion. Thank you for Victory Fund and Victory Institute for being leaders and giving us voice to talk about these very important matters to Black Americans, to LGBTQ, all of us today. So thank you very much. You gentlemen have a great day.
Thank you.